Chains bit into Isolde's wrists as the banker marched her past shuttered doors, and the drifter, watching from the depot, would change everything by nightfall, though nobody in Larkspur Wells had the first notion of it yet. Watching only the iron catch the morning light, and the dust rise soft and gray around a woman's boots as she was walked, link by link, the length of her own town's main street toward an auction block built that same week for exactly this purpose. Her name was Isolde Calloway. She was 27 years old, and it was the last week of April in the spring of 1881 in Larkspur Wells, in the territory of Colorado, and this is the story of the morning a bank president forged a debt against a homestead that had been paid off in full for 2 years, and the quiet, dangerous stranger who stepped down off the morning freight car with a coat too heavy for the season and a price on his head in 3 territories, and decided, before he'd even brushed the cinders off his shoulders, nobody in that crowd lining Main Street that morning could have guessed, watching the stranger's still unhurried face as he stood at the edge of the depot platform with his bedroll over one shoulder, that the coat he wore too heavy for an April morning, or that the quiet in his manner was not the quiet of a man passing through, but the quiet of a man who had learned the hard way exactly how much noise a person could make with a ledger before anyone thought to call it a crime. Nobody could have guessed that the bank president walking a widow down the center of town in irons a smooth, soft-spoken man named alias Marrow, president of the Larkspur Trust and Loan, a man the whole county called reasonable, careful, a credit to the territory's future, had just given that same stranger the one thing that could turn a man passing through into a man who stayed. If stories about the quiet ones, the ones who don't announce a single thing about what they're carrying until the moment it matters, are the kind that keep you up long after you should have gone to bed, then stay with this one all the way through, because Isolde's story does not end on that street in chains. It begins there. Now let's go back to an hour before dawn, to the knock at her door and the paper nobody had ever shown her before that morning, so you can understand exactly how a debt gets invented out of nothing and dressed up to look like the truth. Isolde had been awake before the knock came, the way she'd been awake, before dawn most mornings of the 2 years since her husband Henry died, not from grief exactly anymore, but from habit, the particular habit of a woman running a homestead alone. She'd been up feeding the chickens and checking the spring line that ran clear and cold along the eastern edge of her 110 acres, the same spring that had drawn Henry's grandfather to stake the claim 40 years back, patient hope that turned grass into a homestead. The knock, when it came, was 3 sharp raps from Sheriff Otis Dredge's knuckles, and behind him on her porch steps stood 2 men she didn't know in bank-clean coats, and Elias Marrow himself, hat in hand, wearing the particular gentle, apologetic expression he wore for occasions he wanted witnessed as regrettable rather than deliberate. He had a paper. He held it out to her, the way a man hands over something he genuinely wishes he didn't have to, and told her in a voice pitched low and careful that the Larkspur Trust and Loan held a promissory note signed by her late husband Henry Calloway, dated the spring before his death, securing $900 against the homestead principal, plus 2 years of accrued interest at the rate Henry had agreed to, which came now, with penalties for the debt going unacknowledged so long, to just over $1,400, due in full, or the county would proceed to satisfy the lien by public sale of the property. Isolde had stood in her own doorway, in the gray pre-dawn light, and told him plainly that there was no such note, that Henry had never in his life borrowed $1 he hadn't paid back inside a season, paid in full within the year, and marked so in the bank's own ledger, and she had the receipt in her husband's strongbox to prove it if he'd give her a moment to fetch it. Marrow had smiled at that, the particular patient smile of a man who has already anticipated an objection and prepared well in advance exactly how he intends to absorb it. He was sorry, he said, but the bank's own record showed no such payment recorded against this particular note. A different note, he clarified gently, from the small feed loan she was thinking of, a larger note signed the same season for improvements to the spring channel. The kind of note a careful husband might sign without troubling his wife over the particulars, especially a husband who died before he ever had occasion to mention it to her. He had the paper right there, Henry's signature at the bottom of it, and he was very sorry truly that grief and 2 years' distance made it difficult for a widow to remember every piece of paper her husband had ever put his name to, however much he personally wished it could. It was on its surface a small and reasonable-sounding lie, built the way the best lies are built, mostly true. One careful fabrication buried in the middle of it where a grieving, distracted person might not think to press hard enough to find the seam. Isolde had gone straight to the strongbox the moment the men left her porch and found her $30 feed loan receipt exactly where she remembered leaving it. Marked paid in full in Henry's own careful hand and countersigned, she noticed for the first time with a slow, sick understanding. By a Larkspur Trust and Loan notary, whose signature he did not recognize at all, a man named Simeon Coyle, who had, as it turned out, only taken up the notary's stamp in Larkspur Wells the previous autumn, but which sat wrong in her stomach from the first moment she saw it. What? Isolde did not yet know, standing in her kitchen with a paid receipt in one hand and a forged note somewhere in the bank's vault in the other, was that the Larkspur Trust and Loan had spent the better part of that winter quietly negotiating with a Denver rail syndicate scouting a spur line south through the county. More than anything else in that dry stretch of country, a dependable year-round water source to feed a depot and stockyards, and that the only such water source within 20 miles that wasn't already claimed by a working ranch too large and too well lard to threaten. Cold Spring, running through 110 acres, belonging to a widow with no husband, no grown sons, and, as far as Elias Marrow's careful calculations had concluded, no particular means of defending herself against a paper the bank itself controlled every copy of. He had been patient about it, the way patient men in banking are patient about most things, watching the county records for 2 years, waiting for exactly the right season, the right rail contract. The right moment when a forged note dated safely in the past could be produced without anyone thinking to ask why it had taken the bank 2 full years to mention a $1,400 debt it claimed to have been carrying quietly the entire time. Simeon Coyle, the notary, had been hired the previous autumn specifically for this, a young man freshly arrived from Kansas City with a talent for matching another man's handwriting that Marrow had discovered and quietly rewarded. Exactly as aged and unremarkable as every other document in the bank's vault. Isolde spent that whole first day going door to door in Larkspur Wells, the receipt folded careful in her apron pocket, trying to find someone, the county recorder, the circuit judge, who came through twice a year. What she found instead was a town that had learned, over Marrow's 6 years running, the Larkspur Trust and Loan, exactly how much of its own daily business ran through that bank's good graces, mortgages on half the storefronts along Main Street, notes on next season's seed for half the homesteads within riding distance, a debt owed somewhere by nearly every man with the standing to stand up and say a bank president was lying. The county recorder, a tired, careful man named Ezra Voss, told her privately with real sympathy, and a visible unwillingness to say much more than that he'd noticed the same odd gap she had in the notary dates, and that he'd raise it formally the moment the circuit judge came back through 3 weeks off at least. And Marrow's foreclosure notice gave her exactly 7 days. If stories about a whole town looking away one careful debt at a time while a single family gets ground down make your blood run hot the way they made mine run hot researching this one, then you already understand why Isolde spent the next 6 days doing everything a person can do with almost no leverage at all. Writing to a territorial land office 2 counties over, asking a lawyer in the next town who quoted her a fee she didn't have, walking her own fence line at dusk with her husband's old rifle across her knees, not because she thought a rifle would stop a bank, like the one thing she genuinely could not survive. On the 7th day, Sheriff Otis Dredge came back to her homestead with a county magistrate's order for her arrest, citing an obscure territorial statute on willful non-payment of a lawful debt after formal notice, at Marrow's own quiet suggestion to a magistrate who owed the bank considerably more than he'd ever admit in open court. Dredge was not by nature a cruel man, but he was a tired one, 3 years from a modest pension, with a wife and 4 children in a house the bank held the note on, and he had long since made his private peace with the understanding that the county's law become close enough to the same thing that a sheriff who valued his position stopped trying to tell them apart. The chains, when Dredge produced them from his saddlebag, were ordinary transport irons, the same kind used for prisoners bound to the territorial jail, and Isolde stood very still in her own yard while he fastened them around her wrists, her chin level, her eyes on some fixed point past his shoulder, because she had already decided, somewhere in those 7 days of doors closing gently in her face, that whatever else this county took from her, they would not get to see her break in front of them doing it. Marrow's plan, laid out with the same patient care he gave everything, was simple and, from where he stood, entirely reasonable. Marched the widow the full length of Main Street in irons on a market morning, when the town was thickest with witnesses, not because the statute required a public march at all, but because a whole town watching a debtor humiliated in daylight, he had learned across 6 years of careful debt collection, produce surrender far faster than any courtroom ever did. He wanted her walked past the mercantile, past the church, past the schoolhouse where the children would be let out for morning recess right on schedule, all the way to a hastily built auction platform at the far end of Main Street, where her homestead paid off clear, and hers for 2 years by any honest reading of the record, would be sold that same afternoon to satisfy a debt that existed nowhere except in Simeon Coyle's careful, practiced forgery. The walk itself took the better part of 20 minutes, though it felt to Isolde like it stretched across a whole season of her life compressed into a single morning, the iron cold and heavy at her wrists, the chain drawing a small metallic music with every step that seemed, to her ringing ears, louder than the crowd's own murmur, and the dust of Main Street rising soft around her boots, the same gray dust that had settled over that town every dry April for as long as she could remember, except that this particular morning it settled instead over a woman being walked past her own neighbors like livestock. She passed the mercantile first, its awning throwing a narrow band of shade across the boardwalk, and saw the owner's wife duck back behind a display of canned goods rather than meet her eyes. She passed the church, next its doors standing open for nothing in particular, a few of the older women gathered on the steps falling silent as she came level with them, one crossing herself, none of them stepping down into the street. She passed the schoolhouse last, right on schedule, as Marrow had planned it, and heard, Behind her, the particular hush that fell over a yard full of children when the teacher, without a word, herded them all back inside a full 10 minutes before the recess bell was due. Not one voice rose in that whole 20 minutes to say the word forgery, or theft, or shame, though Isolde would learn later that at least 4 separate households along that street had, in private that same morning, used all 3 words freely behind closed doors. That was the morning the freight train came through Larkspur Wells a few minutes past its usual hour, and a lean, quiet man climbed down out of an empty boxcar with a bedroll over one shoulder, taking the measure of a town, the way a man takes the measure of any place he doesn't yet know whether he needs to trust. Enjoying a story about a town that finally stopped looking away? Tap Join beside the channel name to become a member. It's a small thing that keeps these tales coming every week. His name was Rafe, and he had been riding freight cars and back trails through 3 territories for the better part of 18 months. Moving the way a man moves when he can't stay anywhere long enough to be remembered clearly, because there were posters with his likeness nailed up in courthouses from the Kansas line to the Wyoming border. Offering money for a man wanted, on paper, for killing 3 men in 3 separate counties over 3 separate years. What the posters didn't say, because the men who'd printed them had no particular interest in saying it, was that all 3 of the men Rafe had killed had been land agents and bank officers, and used a county's own law against families, too poor or too isolated to fight back, until somebody finally decided the law wasn't coming, and did something about it himself. Rafe had grown up on a Kansas homestead his own family lost to precisely that kind of paper, watched his father age 10 years in a single season trying to fight a debt that turned out years later to have never truly existed, and had come out of that boyhood with a particular, permanent hatred for any man who used a ledger the way other men used a gun, because a gun, at least a person could see coming. He stood at the depot a moment longer than he needed to, watching the crowd gather along Main Street the way a crowd gathers for a spectacle it hasn't yet decided how to feel about, and something in the shape of it, the chains, the careful unhurried pace of the man in the good black coat walking a few steps behind the prisoner, the particular studied gentleness in that man's face, the kind of gentleness Rafe had learned, across 3 territories and 3 dead men, to recognize as the specific mask worn by someone who has convinced himself that cruelty conducted politely doesn't quite count as cruelty, even before he heard a single word of the actual charge. He did not intervene, not at first, and not because he lacked the nerve for it. 3 territories worth of wanted posters testified plainly enough to that, but because a man riding under a false name, with a price on his head, had learned the hard way, before he understood exactly what he was walking into, and who else in that crowd might already be armed, paid, or simply frightened enough to make trouble. So Rafe fell in at the back edge of the crowd instead, hat brim low, watching the way he'd learned to watch a room before he ever decided what to do about it, and it was there, in that first close look at the woman being marched past him in irons, that he noticed the thing that mattered most. Not fear in her face, though there was plenty of reason for it, but a kind of level, furious composure, the particular stillness of someone who has already decided that whatever this town does to her body, they will not get to decide what it means about her worth. Isolde felt the crowd's eyes on her the whole length of that walk, felt the particular weight of being looked at by people she'd known for years, the mercantile owner who'd extended her credit gladly a dozen times, the school teacher whose children she'd nursed through a fever the winter before last, a whole town that had, in 7 short days, learned to look at the ground or across the street rather than meet her eyes. And she kept her chin level anyway because Henry had taught her in 7 good years of marriage that a person's worth was never actually up for a crowd's vote. She noticed the stranger at the edge of the depot platform without quite meaning to, the way you notice one still thing in a moving crowd, and something about the particular quality of his attention, not gawking, not looking away either, just watching with an unhurried, careful precision that felt entirely unlike everyone else's discomfort, snagged at her attention for exactly as long as the chains allowed her to keep looking anywhere but straight ahead. Marrow reached the auction platform first, climbed the 3 rough plank steps with the easy confidence of a man arriving at his own party, and turned to address the gathered crowd in the warm, regretful voice he reserved for occasions like this one, a voice built over 6 careful years to make an audience feel that whatever unpleasant thing was about to happen was being done gently, reluctantly, and entirely for the good of a county that needed its debts, collected honestly if it was ever going to prosper the way the coming railroad promised it could. He spoke of the sanctity of a lawful note, of the bank's patience already stretched thin over 2 years of silence on a debt he characterized with a small regretful shake of his head, as regrettably typical of how grief could make even an honest woman forgetful of her late husband's obligations. And he assured the crowd that the sale that afternoon would be conducted fairly, openly, exactly the way the territory's law required, every word of it delivered with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has never once, in 6 years, needed to raise his voice to get precisely what he wanted. It was Sheriff Dredge, standing at the base of the platform steps with the chain's free end looped once around his own gloved hand, who first noticed the quiet man had moved. Rafe had come forward through the crowd without seeming to hurry the way water finds the low ground without anyone quite watching it move, and by the time Dredge registered him as anything more than another spectator, he was already standing at the front edge of the gathering, his eyes on Marrow with a stillness that made the sheriff's own hand tighten, unconsciously, around the chain he was holding. "That's an interesting note you're reading off," Rafe said, his voice pitched low, but carrying clean across a crowd that had gone quiet the instant a stranger spoke up in the middle of a bank president's speech. "Dated when, exactly?" Marrow's composure didn't crack. 6 years of practice had taught him better than that, but something in his eyes went carefully, still assessing the particular flicker of a man recalculating who, exactly, he was now dealing with. "The spring of '79, if it's any concern of yours, mister. I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "We haven't." Rafe let that sit a beat, unbothered by the silence, in a way that made a few people near the front of the crowd shift their weight uneasily, sensing something in the exchange they couldn't yet name. "Just curious what a note looks like that a dead man's supposed to have signed, when his widow's holding a receipt in her apron pocket right now marking the only debt they ever actually had with your bank paid in full a year before he died." A murmur moved through the crowd at that, not loud but enough that Marrow's easy expression tightened by the smallest visible degree, and he recovered with the same practiced smoothness he brought to every objection, explaining, patiently, that a woman's memory 2 years distant from her husband's death was an unreliable measure against a bank's own written record, and that he understood a stranger's instinct toward chivalry but would ask him kindly to let county business proceed as county business required. It was a good answer, the kind that had shut down every previous objection anyone in Larkspur Wells had ever raised against him, and it might have worked again if Rafe had been the sort of man who let an answer like that end a conversation. He wasn't. "Funny thing about county business," Rafe said, still unhurried, still quiet enough that the whole crowd had to lean in a little to catch it. I've seen a fair amount of it in 3 different territories. And it generally goes smoother when the man calling the debt isn't the same man who stands to walk away holding the water rights once the widow's off the land. He let his eyes move once, deliberately, toward the spring line, visible beyond the edge of town, then back to Marrow. That spring runs year-round. I'd guess that matters more to a rail line, scouting a depot site, than it does to a $1,400 feed note. Marrow's face went for just a fraction of a second entirely still, the practiced warmth dropping away like a mask slipping before he caught himself and pulled it back into place, and Isolde, chained at the base of the platform steps, watching that half-second flicker with her whole attention fixed on it, felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 7 long days. Not certainty yet, not quite, but the first real crack of daylight through a door she'd begun to believe was sealed shut for good. "I don't know who you are, mister, or what business you imagine you have here," Marrow said, and the warmth was still in his voice, but something colder moved underneath it now, close enough to the surface that Sheriff Dredge, standing between them with the chain still looped around his hand, felt the temperature of the whole crowd change. "But I'd think carefully before you go accusing a bank president of anything in front of half this county without a scrap of proof beyond a stranger's guesswork." "I don't guess much," Rafe said. "I just recognize the shape of this particular trick when I see it. I've seen it 3 times before in 3 different counties, and I buried the last man who tried it before he ever got the chance to auction off what he'd stolen." He let the words land plain, without a raised voice, without a single wasted gesture, something in the particular flatness of his delivery. The way a man states an old settled fact rather than a threat made Sheriff Dredge's hand ease, very slightly, and made half the crowd along the front of Main Street take an involuntary half-step back. Marrow recovered his composure faster than most men would have, smoothing the whole exchange over with an easy laugh and a remark to the crowd about drifters with a taste for drama, and pressed forward with the auction's opening bid, calling for the county's minimum offer on 110 acres with year-round water. Watching Marrow's hands steady on the surface but just faintly, almost imperceptibly, unsteady at the fingertips, that Rafe understood he'd rattled something real, even if he didn't yet have the proof to finish the job. He didn't need to, not yet, and a man wanted in 3 territories, bidding openly on contested land in front of a sheriff was exactly the kind of foolish, memorable mistake that got a person recognized fast. Instead, he stepped back into the crowd, unhurried, watchful, and spent the rest of that first auction, which Marrow, rattled but not defeated, pushed through anyway, gaveling a token opening bid from a rancher who'd clearly been arranged in advance to buy time and legitimacy. Cataloging every small detail he could gather, the notary's name stamped at the bottom of the note Marrow read aloud, the particular unfamiliar handwriting, Isolde herself, standing in chains, called out plainly. Marrow, for his part, gavelled a delay rather than a completed sale, citing the stranger's public accusation as grounds to postpone the final transfer 3 days, ostensibly to allow the bank to produce further documentation. Marrow buying himself time to shore up whatever gaps in his forgery a stranger's sharp eye had just exposed in front of half the county. She was walked back to the county jail in chains that afternoon anyway, held on the original non-payment charge regardless of the sale's postponement, and it was there in a small stone cell with one high window. The particular stillness in the stranger's eyes when he'd said he'd buried the last man who tried this, Rafe did not leave Larkspur Wells that night, though every instinct built over 18 months of running told him a smart man moved on before a sheriff got curious about exactly who'd shown up on the morning freight. He took a room instead above the town's one saloon, paid for a week in advance in coin that drew a raised eyebrow from the barkeep but no questions, and spent that first evening doing the quiet, patient work he'd learned across 3 territories was worth more than any amount of confrontation. Unremarkable questions of anyone willing to talk over a drink, piecing together the shape of Elias Marrow's 6 years in Larkspur Wells, the way a man reads tracks in soft ground, one small overlooked detail at a time. What he learned over that first evening and the 2 days that followed was a pattern he recognized in his bones. A bank president who'd arrived in Larkspur Wells 6 years back with modest capital and had, in that time, come to hold the mortgage on nearly every storefront on Main Street and the note on half the homesteads within riding distance. Notary Simeon Coyle, who'd taken up his stamp the previous autumn and had in the months since notarized an unusual number of old debts nobody quite remembered signing. A county magistrate 3 seasons behind on his own note to the Larkspur Trust and Loan, who had signed the arrest order without, as far as anyone could recall, actually reviewing the underlying claim, and a sheriff, Otis Dredge, who was, by every account Rafe gathered, not a cruel man at all, just a tired one, cornered by his own family's debt into enforcing a system he'd long since stopped believing in. It was the old bank teller, a careful, quiet woman named Miriam Voss, who'd worked the Larkspur Trust and Loans ledgers for 11 years and had watched Marrow's rise with a private growing unease she'd never had anywhere safe to voice, who gave Rafe the peace he actually needed. He found her on the second evening, closing up the mercantile where she kept a second job doing the town's bookkeeping, and asked her, plainly and without pretense, whether she'd ever noticed anything irregular in the bank's larger notes over the past year. She was quiet a long moment, the particular quiet of a person deciding whether a stranger could be trusted with something that might cost her a job she badly needed, and then she told him, low, that she'd kept her own private set of notes for years, not out of any grand plan. Just an old habit from a previous position where a different employer's carelessness had cost her dearly. A habit of copying key figures into a small ledger of her own before Marrow's larger transactions ever crossed her desk for filing, and that the feed loan payment Henry Calloway had made 4 years back, $30 marked paid in full, was recorded in her private ledger in her own hand, dated a full 8 months before Simeon Coyle had ever set foot in Larkspur Wells to take up his notary's stamp. It was the quiet people a town overlooks, the tired sheriff, the careful teller, the widow nobody thought had any fight left in her, who ended up bringing the whole rotten structure down, one honest overlooked fact at a time, and Rafe understood, gathering those facts, that patience had won him more ground. It was not on its own quite enough a private ledger kept by a bank teller could be dismissed. Rafe understood, as easily as a widow's memory had been dismissed on the auction platform, unless it could be tied to something the county itself would have to acknowledge as official record. So on the third morning, with the postponed sale bearing down and Isolde still held in the county jail on the original charge, Rafe rode the 6 miles to the county recorder's office and found Ezra Voss exactly where Isolde had found him a week earlier, still quietly troubled by the notary date gap he'd noticed, and still by his own tired admission, done willing to raise it formally before the circuit judge without more than a hunch to back it. Rafe laid Miriam Voss's private ledger dates alongside the recorder's own filing records, and the 2 men worked through them together for the better part of an hour, And what emerged plain and undeniable once someone finally sat down to actually compare the dates side by side was a note supposedly signed and witnessed 8 months before the witness in question had ever arrived in the county. A forgery so simple once exposed that both men sat afterward in a kind of quiet, furious disbelief that it had taken this long. Voss, to his credit, did not hesitate once he saw the dates laid out plain. He drafted an emergency notice to the circuit judge whose writing schedule, as it happened, had him passing within a day's ride of Larkspur Wells that very week, and dispatched it by his fastest rider that same afternoon, along with a formal county recorder's finding that the notarization underlying the Calloway debt could not have occurred, as dated, and required immediate judicial review before any transfer of the property proceeded. It was, Rafe understood, riding back into town with that finding folded in his coat, the single piece of paper capable of doing what 3 territories' worth of a wanted man's gun never quite could. Elias Marrow had not spent the 3 days of the postponed sale idle either. He'd sent his own rider to the territorial capital, seeking an expedited transfer order, arguing to a friendly judge there that a stranger's unsubstantiated accusations shouldn't be allowed to hold county business hostage indefinitely, and by the 3rd morning he had in hand a document authorizing immediate completion of the sale, regardless of any pending local review, a document he intended to produce at the reconvened auction with exactly the same unhurried confidence he brought to everything, betting, correctly as it happened, that most men in his position would have folded under 3 days of a wanted stranger's scrutiny and moved on rather than risk actual exposure. What Marrow had not counted on, standing on that auction platform a 3rd time with the whole town gathered once more and Isolde brought up from the county jail in the same transport irons, chin level, watching him with a stillness that had only hardened over 3 days rather than broken. Not alone this time, but flanked by Ezra Voss with the recorder's formal finding in hand, and by Miriam Voss, who had made her own quiet, considerable decision over those 3 days that a job worth keeping by staying silent about a forged note. Marrow began exactly as he had the first time, warm and regretful and unhurried, producing his territorial transfer order with the easy confidence of a man who believed the matter already settled. For the first time in 6 years, decided he was done looking the other way. Elias, before you finish that sentence, I've got a formal finding here, says the notary date on the underlying note predates Simeon Coyle's arrival in this county by 8 months, which by any territorial statute I've ever read makes the note itself void on its face, transfer order or not. He held the paper up plain for the crowd to see, his voice carrying clean across Main Street. I'd think hard about how you want to answer that in front of this many witnesses. The color that moved through Marrow's face then was not the careful, controlled warmth he'd worn for 6 years. It was something raw underneath, finally showing through. A man watching a structure he'd built with enormous patience come apart in the space of a single sentence. Some smooth explanation half-formed already behind his eyes, when Miriam Voss stepped forward beside Voss with her own small private ledger held open in both hands, and said in a voice that shook slightly but did not stop, that she had personally recorded the Calloway feed loan payment as satisfied in full in her own hand. 8 months before the notary, whose name backed the fraudulent note, had ever taken up his stamp in Larkspur Wells, and that she was prepared, effective that morning, to say so under oath to the circuit judge, her position at the bank. Marrow's composure did not survive that. Something in his face went hard and cornered, the mask he'd worn for 6 years finally completely gone, and he turned toward Sheriff Dredge with a sharpness that made the whole crowd go still, ordering him in a voice with none of its old warmth left in it to arrest the recorder and the teller both for interfering with lawful county business. And it was Dredge, standing at the base of the platform with the chain still looped loosely around his own hand, who finally, after 6 years of careful looking away, refused him outright. Dredge said it plain, not loud but final. The particular tired finality of a man setting down a weight he'd carried far longer than he should have. I've been enforcing your paper on this town for 2 years past, when I ought to have started asking harder questions, and I'm done. Ezra's finding stands until a circuit judge says otherwise, and he reached down without another word and unlocked the transport irons from Isolde's wrists, the metal falling away with a sound that seemed, in the sudden hush of Main Street, louder than anything Marrow had said all morning. Isolde stood free for the first time in 3 days, rubbing the raw skin at her wrists, and looked past Sheriff Dredge to the quiet stranger standing at the front of the crowd, and found him already watching her with the same unhurried stillness he'd worn from the very first moment at the depot platform. And something passed between them in that look that neither of them had words for yet, though both of them, in their own separate and private ways, understood exactly what it was. Marrow made one last attempt, reaching for the territorial transfer order still clutched in his hand, as though the paper itself might yet save him, and it was Rafe who finally stepped forward close enough now that Marrow could see, up close, exactly what kind of stillness he'd been dismissing for 3 days as a drifter's bluster. "You've got maybe one honest choice left to you," Rafe said, quiet enough that only the front rank of the crowd caught it clean, "and that's to hand that order and every forged note in your vault over to the recorder right now, before the circuit judge gets here and decides for himself whether Larkspur County's got room in its jail for a bank president. I've watched 3 men make your exact choice in 3 different counties, and not one of them liked how it ended when they waited too long to make the honest one." He let that sit, unhurried, the particular flat certainty in his voice carrying more weight than any raised threat could have managed. "Your call, Marrow, but I'd make it fast." It was, in the end, not Rafe's stillness, or Voss's finding, or even Miriam Foss's quiet courage that finally broke Marrow completely, but the sight of his own bank's ledgers, seized that same afternoon under Voss's authority and searched by lamplight with Dredge himself standing witness, turning up not 1 forged note but 4. Careful thefts spread across 3 years, each one timed to a widow's grief or a family's hard season, each one small enough, alone, that no single victim had ever thought to compare notes with the others, the whole pattern. Marrow was arrested that same night, not by a stranger's gun but by his own sheriff's hand, on charges of forgery and fraud that would, once the circuit judge arrived 2 days later and reviewed every page Voss and Miriam Foss had assembled, carry him off to the territorial prison at Chignon City, for a term long enough that Larkspur Wells would not see him walk its streets again for the better part of 2 decades. The circuit judge, on arriving, voided the fraudulent note in full, restored the Calloway homestead's clear title exactly as it had stood before Marrow's scheme ever touched it, and moved, he said plainly in open court, by the particular gall of a man who'd chained a widow in irons and marched her down Main Street over a debt he'd invented himself. Ordered the Larkspur Trust and Loans remaining assets placed under a court-appointed trustee until every one of Marrow's other victims could be identified and made whole. Simeon Coyle, faced with the plain evidence of his forged notarizations, gave a full confession within a day of his own arrest, trading testimony against Marrow for a lighter charge. Exactly why their own hard seasons had never quite added up the way the bank's ledger insisted they should. Isolde walked out of the county jail that same evening, a free woman with a clear title to her own land, and found Rafe waiting at the bottom of the steps. Not because anyone had asked him to be there, but because 3 days into a town he'd meant to pass through inside an afternoon, he had found himself with no particular wish to leave yet. "County's satisfied," she said, and there was something almost unsteady in her voice. For the first time in 8 days, the particular unsteadiness of a person finally allowed to set down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd half forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. My land, my name, all of it clear again. "Good," Rafe said, and there was no flourish in the word, just the plain quiet satisfaction of a man who had watched a wrong get set right and found it worth every risk it had cost him to stay and see it through. Man could ride a long time and not see that happen even once. "You could have kept riding," Isolde said. 3 days is a long time for a man with your kind of trouble to stay in one town." "Some things are worth the trouble," Rafe said, and something in the careful, unhurried way he said it told her plainly enough that he wasn't only talking about the note. If you want more stories where the quiet ones finally get their due, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It directly supports the next one getting made. Word of what had happened on Main Street traveled through Larkspur Wells and well beyond it. Within days, the particular fast, unstoppable way word travels through a small county, once a truth long suspected finally gets proven in daylight. Slowly and awkwardly at first, and then with something closer to real shame. The mercantile owner who'd extended Isolde credit for years and then looked away the morning she was chained, came to her homestead personally, hat in hand, and did not try to explain himself beyond a plain, halting apology she chose, after some consideration. The schoolteacher whose children Isolde had nursed through fever brought a basket of preserves and cried harder over it than Isolde herself did, which struck Isolde in a private moment afterward as exactly the kind of thing a person did. Sheriff Otis Dredge, for his part, resigned his position within the month, not in disgrace, but in a kind of quiet, deliberate penance, and took work instead as a hired hand on a ranch 2 counties over. Miriam Voss, whose small private ledger had done more to unravel Marrow's 6 years of careful theft than any lawman's investigation ever managed, was appointed by the court-appointed trustee to help sort out the Larkspur Trust and Loan's tangled books, a task that took the better part of that whole summer and turned up eventually. Enough recovered funds to make partial restitution to all 4 of Marrow's identified victims. Not everything they'd lost, not nearly, but enough, in most cases, to keep a family's land or livestock from slipping away entirely in the theft's aftermath. Hazra Voss, the county recorder, found himself something of a quiet local hero after years of being the sort of careful, unremarkable official nobody in Larkspur Wells had ever thought much about one way or another, and he wore the attention with the same plain discomfort he'd worn everything else, preferring, he told anyone who asked, to simply get back to the ordinary business of keeping the county's records honest, which he considered, after everything, the whole of what his job had ever actually required of him. Rafe did not leave Larkspur Wells that week or the week after, though he understood plainly enough that a wanted man could not simply stay in one place indefinitely without some reckoning of his own eventually catching up to him. He told Isolde the truth of it one evening on her porch, the two of them watching the light go long and gold over the spring line that had very nearly cost her everything, laying out plain the 3 killings that had put his likeness on courthouse walls from Kansas to Wyoming, each one running some version of the exact theft Marrow had tried to run against her. Each one stopped only after Rafe had exhausted every honest channel a county's law offered. He did not dress it up as heroism, and he did not ask her forgiveness for it either, only told it to her straight, the way he'd learned, across 18 months of running, that a person deserved the truth even when the truth cost him whatever chance he might have had at staying. Isolde listened to the whole of it without interrupting, the particular careful, patient listening she'd learned from Henry across 7 good years of marriage. And when he finished, she was quiet a long moment, turning it over, before she told him plainly that looking away was easier than doing the hard, risky, correct thing, and that she was not about to start measuring a man's worth by the same cowardly arithmetic that had nearly cost her everything. "You stopped men who were stealing from families with nowhere else to turn," she said. "I don't imagine the law and what's right have ever lined up as neatly as courthouse posters like to pretend they do." It was Ezra Voss in the end who found the narrow, honest path through Rafe's particular trouble, writing, on his own authority as county recorder and with Judge Halloran's eventual quiet blessing, a full and detailed account of everything that had happened in Larkspur Wells that spring, including plain testimony from 4 separate victims across 3 territories as to the true nature of the men Rafe had killed, and forwarding that account through channels that took the better part of 2 months to work themselves out, signed by nearly every family whose land or name Rafe's actions, however unlawful, on paper, had ultimately helped protect. It was not a fast process, and it was not a certain one, and Rafe spent those 2 months doing the same quiet, useful work around Isolde's homestead that he'd have done whether the pardon came through or not, mending fence, clearing the spring channel of 2 years' accumulated silt, because he had decided, somewhere in that first long conversation on her porch, that he would rather spend whatever time he had left, pardoned or not, doing something that actually mended what a ledger and a gun had both, in their different ways, spent his whole adult life breaking. The pardon came through in late June, a single sheet of territorial letterhead that Rafe read twice, standing in Isolde's kitchen, before he trusted it enough to set it down on the table between them. It cleared his name in all 3 territories, cited the sworn testimony of the families he'd protected, and closed with a line from the governor's own hand, noting that a territory built on land claims and hard-won homesteads owed more, not less, to the men who stood between a family and the kind of theft the law itself had too often failed to stop, in time. Isolde read it over his shoulder, and when she looked up at him afterward, there was something in her face that hadn't fully settled there since before Henry's death. Not the absence of grief, which she understood by then never fully left a person. They were married that September in the small Larkspur Wells church with the school teacher's children scattering wildflowers up the aisle, and Ezra Voss standing as witness and Miriam Foss crying, again harder. Ongoing act of collective apology, which she found, on the whole, she was willing to accept in the spirit it was offered. The homestead prospered in the years that followed, the spring running clear and cold exactly as it always had, feeding not just Isolde and Rafe's own growing herd, but eventually a modest depot the rail syndicate did build 2 miles east. Once it became clear the water they needed was hers to bargain with, rather than theirs to simply take. The 4 families whose land, livestock, or savings Marrow had quietly stolen across 3 careful years found their own separate reckonings that summer, each one a smaller echo of Isolde's own. The Kestrel family, who'd lost a season's cattle to a forged lien nobody had thought to question, recovered enough in restitution to rebuild their herd within 2 years. An elderly widower named Prosper Adler, whose modest savings account Marrow had quietly drained through a fabricated series of loan fees, lived out his remaining years on a small settlement that let him keep his home free and clear, and made a point, every spring after, of riding out to thank Isolde personally for the stranger who'd started the whole unraveling. Larkspur Wells changed, too, in the slower, harder way. A whole town changes once it has been forced to watch itself fail a good woman in broad daylight and then, belatedly, scramble to make it right. The trust and loan reopened eventually under new, closely watched management, and the county recorder's office under Ezra Voss's continued careful stewardship developed a reputation across that stretch of Colorado territory for the kind of thoroughness that made forging a note against a widow's homestead a considerably harder trick to pull off than it had once been. And on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch of the homestead, her husband's grandfather had staked 40 years before, watching the light go long and gold across a spring that had very nearly cost her everything and had, in the end, saved it. Instead, Isolde Calloway understood that the worst morning of her life, the chains, the walk down Main Street, the whole watching town, had not been the last true thing anyone ever said about her worth, but simply the hardest chapter of a story that, in the end, had never truly belonged to Elias Marrow at all. It belonged to her, and to the quiet man who'd stepped off a freight car with nothing to gain, and stayed anyway, and to a spring that ran clear and cold through land that was, at last and for good, entirely,